The deputy was standing in my driveway with one hand resting near his belt, telling me I was being detained for trespassing on property that I had owned for almost 20 years. Behind him, Margaret Vale stood in the sunlight with her arms crossed, wearing that tiny little smile people wear when they have already decided you are beneath them. And the worst part was, for about 3 seconds, I almost believed I was the crazy one. My name is Caleb Turner, and back then I was 52, with a bad left knee, a stubborn lower back, and the kind of hands that never look clean no matter how hard you scrub them. I'd spent most of my adult life running HVAC lines through attics hot enough to bake bread, crawling under houses where spiders lived at you like you were the intruder, and fixing air conditioners for people who always seemed to discover they loved you right around your lie. I was not rich, not powerful, not one of those guys who had a lawyer on speed dial and a boat named after his second wife. I was just a regular man living in a little white ranch house at the edge of a planned community called Maple Hollow Reserve, a place with fresh mulch, matching mailboxes, and people who said things like neighborhood character with a straight face. Now, my house was older than every other house in Maple Hollow by about 40 years, and that mattered more than anybody understood at first. My grandmother, Ruth Turner, bought that land in 1978, back when that whole side of the county was cow pasture, gravel roads, and one blinking yellow light outside a feed store. She was a small woman, barely 5'2", but she had the spine of a railroad spike and the kind of patience that made impatient people nervous. When developers came around years later, wearing pressed shirts and carrying rolled-out plans, she listened politely while they talked about growth, opportunity, modern living, all those shiny words people use when they want something that belongs to you. She sold them most of the acreage. Sure, enough for cul-de-sacs, a clubhouse, a walking trail, and all those houses painted in 3 approved shades of beige. But she kept my house, the gravel drive, and a handful of strange little strips and corners scattered through the development. At the time, I thought she was just being difficult, because Ruth Turner could make a stone wall look flexible. But she once tapped the kitchen table with her coffee spoon and told me, "Caleb, never hand a hungry man the whole loaf. Keep the heel. One day he will need it more than he wants to admit." I laughed when she said it, because I was 26 and thought wisdom was something old people invented to make young people stop talking. Years later, standing in my own driveway with a deputy looking at me like he might have to cuff me, I finally understood she had not been joking. For a long time, Maple Hollow was not a bad place. In the early days, people still waved from porches, kids left bicycles in the grass, and nobody called a meeting because somebody planted tomatoes where decorative grasses were supposed to be. I fixed Mrs. Delaney's furnace one winter and refused payment because her husband had just died. I helped a young couple across the street install a ceiling fan, even though the husband kept calling the breaker box the electricity cabinet, which, I will admit, tested my Christian kindness. Friday evenings, I would sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watch the sun go down behind the retention pond, and think maybe this was what my grandmother wanted, a place that grew up around us without swallowing us whole. Then Margaret Vale moved in. She arrived in a black luxury SUV so polished it looked like it had never known a dirt road existed, and within 6 months she knew every mailbox, every fence line, every rumor, and every weakness in the neighborhood. Within a year, she was on the Homeowners Association board. By the next spring, she was president, and suddenly Maple Hollow stopped feeling like a neighborhood and started feeling like an inspection. Margaret was not loud, not at first. That was what made her dangerous. Loud people warn you. Margaret smiled, tilted her head, and said cruel things in the tone of someone reminding you to take an umbrella. The first note she left on my door said my side shed had a rustic appearance inconsistent with community standards. Rustic, mind you, was HOA language for Caleb. Your shed looks poor. Then came the comment about my vegetable beds being visually disruptive. Then came a letter about my work truck, which she called a commercial vehicle even though it was just an old blue Ford with a cracked dashboard and more miles than a traveling preacher. I went to one HOA meeting to clear things up, mostly because my neighbor Tom said it would be easier than arguing through letters. That was my first mistake. Margaret sat at the front of the room under fluorescent lights, tapping her pen against a binder thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet, and when I explained that my property was not part of the association, she looked at me like I had tracked mud across her dining room. "Mr. Turner," she said, Every home within the visual boundaries of Maple Hollow is expected to comply with the same standards. I said, expected by who? She smiled. By the community. Now, I have learned that when certain people say community, what they mean is themselves. But louder, I told her I had never signed HOA papers, never paid dues, and never agreed to their rules. A few people shifted in their chairs. Nobody spoke. Margaret closed her binder slowly, and I remember that sound, that soft little snap, like a trap being set. She said, "We will look into that." After that night, the friendly reminders turned into violations. I got a notice for using power tools at 1 in the afternoon on a Saturday. I got another because my niece parked in my driveway during a family barbecue and her back tire touched the grass. Someone reported that I was running an illegal repair shop out of my garage because I fixed Tom's compressor and he brought me a peach pie as thanks. That one still makes me laugh, because if pie counts as taxable income, half the churches in America are in trouble. But underneath the ridiculousness, something ugly was happening. Neighbors stopped asking me for help. Conversations got quiet when I walked up to the mailboxes. People who had known me for years suddenly found reasons to stare at their phones. Margaret did not just want me to obey. She wanted everyone to see what happened when someone did not. The real breaking point came when I put solar panels on my roof. They were not fancy. They were not even that visible from the street unless you were standing there hunting for reasons to be offended, which, as it turned out, was Margaret's full-time hobby. She marched up my driveway on a hot Tuesday afternoon with 2 board members behind her, both looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. She pointed at my roof and said, "You are required to submit exterior changes for approval before installation." I wiped my hands on a rag and said, "Margaret, I'm going to say this as kindly as I can. I do not answer to your board." Her face tightened, not much, just enough for me to see the person behind the manners. She said, "You live inside this community." I said, "No, I live beside it. There is a difference." One of the board members stared at his shoes. The other pretended to study my gutters like they held scripture. Margaret stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Men like you always think rules are for other people." I looked at her then, really looked, and I saw it was not about the panels, or the shed, or the truck. It was about the fact that I had told her no, calmly, publicly, and without asking permission. 2 weeks later, a sheriff's deputy pulled into my driveway. I was replacing a busted hinge on the side gate, sweat running down my neck, when I heard tires crunch behind me. Margaret was already there, of course, standing near the curb like she'd been waiting for her scene to begin. The deputy asked if I was Caleb Turner, and when I said yes, he told me there had been a complaint that I was trespassing on association-controlled access property and refusing to leave. I actually laughed, just once, because what else do you do when reality trips over its own shoes? I said, "Officer, this is my driveway." He looked uncomfortable, and that told me something right away. Good cops do not enjoy being dragged into neighborhood nonsense. Margaret stepped forward and said, "Deputy, the association has maps clearly identifying this as shared access frontage. Mr. Turner has a long pattern of non-compliance. Shared access frontage." That was the phrase she had chosen to steal my driveway while keeping her lipstick neat. The deputy glanced from her to me, and I could see him trying to decide whether this was a property dispute or a crazy man making trouble. My heart was pounding, but not from fear exactly. It was more like anger wearing a winter coat, heavy and quiet. For months, I'd been carrying a folded county survey in the back pocket of my truck, mostly because something in my gut told me Margaret was not finished. That day, I reached through the open window, grabbed it from the seat, unfolded it across the hood, and pointed to the thick black boundary line running right under the deputy's boots. I said, "That line right there is mine. My grandmother kept it, and unless the county courthouse burned down this morning, you were standing on Turner land." Margaret laughed, sharp and thin. "Old paperwork does not override association authority." I looked at her and said, "Margaret, paperwork is authority." That was the first time I saw her smile disappear. The deputy looked down at that survey like it had personally ruined his afternoon, and I cannot blame him, because nobody wakes up hoping to referee a property line fight between a tired HVAC guy and a woman dressed like she was about to testify before Congress. He studied the county stamp, then the parcel number, then the line under his boots, and I watched his shoulders change before his face did. That is one thing you learn working with people long enough. The body tells the truth before the mouth catches up. He took one slow step backward, off the blacktop and onto the strip of grass beside it, then cleared his throat and said, "I'm going to need to verify this with the county." Margaret snapped. "Verify what?" "Deputy, this man has been warned repeatedly. He's interfering with association access." The deputy did not answer her right away, which was the first real sound of her losing control. He walked back to his cruiser with the survey in his hand, and there we were, Margaret and me, standing in that thick summer heat while cicadas screamed from the maples like they had money on the outcome. She came closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something sharp and expensive, and she said under her breath, "You think you are clever, don't you?" I said, "No, Mum. I think my grandmother was." Her eyes narrowed. "People like you always hide behind technicalities." I almost laughed again, but by then I was too tired. I said, "Funny, because people like you usually call technicalities rules when they help you." For a second, I thought she might slap me, not because she was violent, but because she was the kind of person who had never been denied in public without a room, politely pretending not to notice. The deputy came back a few minutes later, and he was careful now, professional in that measured way people get when they realize the floor is not where they thought it was. "Mr. Turner," he said, "based on what I am seeing, I do not have grounds to detain you. This appears to be a civil property matter." Margaret turned red from her neck up. "That is unacceptable." The deputy gave her a look I had seen many times from men who had been sent to fix one problem and discovered somebody else had caused 10 more. "Mon, if the association believes it has a claim, you will need to take it to court." He handed me back the survey, nodded once, and left. No cuffs, no apology, but I was not looking for one. I just wanted my driveway back. Margaret stood there a moment longer, and the silence between us felt better than any speech I could have made. Then she said, "This is not over, Caleb." I folded the survey slowly and said, "I know." That was the honest answer, because people like Margaret do not lose one round and go home to reflect. They reload. The following Monday, County Code Enforcement showed up about an anonymous complaint that I was operating an unlicensed mechanical business from my garage. On Wednesday, I got a notice claiming improper storage of hazardous materials because I had 2 sealed cans of refrigerant locked in a cabinet, exactly where they were supposed to be. That Friday, a zoning officer asked why my work truck was parked on residential property, and I told him because I lived there, and trucks, as a general rule, do not sleep at motels. He tried not to smile. I started keeping a folder on my kitchen table, then 2 folders, then a plastic storage bin. Letters, photos, dates, names, every little paper mosquito bite Margaret sent my way. At first I told myself documentation was just protection, but the truth was darker than that. I was angry. Not the loud kind of angry that makes you stupid, but the quiet kind that gets you up early and keeps you reading county records until your eyes burn. The thing that pushed me from defending myself to digging for the whole truth was Mrs. Alvarez. She lived 3 houses down from the clubhouse, a widow in her 70s who made tamales every Christmas and used to bring my grandmother a plate without asking. She came to my porch one evening holding an HOA violation letter in both hands, like it was a medical bill she could not afford. Margaret had fined her $200 because her grandson had drawn a hopscotch board in sidewalk chalk near the walking trail. Sidewalk chalk. Rain could have handled it for free. Mrs. Alvarez asked me, "Caleb, can they really do this?" And I hated that I did not know. That night, I drove to the county records office first thing in the morning instead of heading to a job. The building was ugly in the way government buildings are ugly. Beige brick, tired carpet, fluorescent lights humming like they knew everybody's secrets. A clerk named Denise Whitaker helped me, and Denise had the energy of a woman who had spent 25 years watching people discover their family histories were messier than Thanksgiving. She pulled up my grandmother's deeds, the original development agreement, the subdivision maps, and after about 20 minutes, she stopped scrolling. Then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Mr. Turner, has anyone from Maple Hollow ever talked to you about these retained parcels?" I said, "What retained parcels?" She turned the monitor a little so I could see. There they were, little shapes on the map. Odd strips, wedges, corners, pieces so awkward they looked accidental unless you saw how perfectly they sat on the things everyone used. The clubhouse parking apron, the walking trail entrance, part of the stormwater pond, the mailbox pavilion, a strip behind the playground where the drainage line ran. Not association land, not developer land, Turner land. My grandmother's heel of the loaf. I sat there staring at the screen while the room got very quiet around me. Denise clicked into another document, then another, and the picture got worse for Maple Hollow and clearer for me. The association had been maintaining and improving those areas for years, collecting dues, sending fines, claiming authority. But the underlying land had never been transferred. There was a temporary access and maintenance easement from the original developer, limited term, with conditions, and according to the renewal clause, it was set to expire in 14 months unless the landowner extended it in writing. The landowner was me. I remember Denise saying, "Well, this is interesting," in the same tone somebody might use while standing over a sinkhole. I went home with certified copies in a brown envelope, and for the first time in months, I slept like a man who had found the light switch in a dark room. But light attracts bugs, and Margaret noticed. I hired a survey crew the next week, a father and son outfit out of Bentham County. The father, Earl Pike, had skin like old saddle leather and a voice like gravel in a coffee can. He walks the property with me, chewing a toothpick, and every now and then he would look at the map and chuckle. "Your grandmother had a mean sense of geometry," he said. By sundown, bright pink flags and wooden stakes marked boundaries all over Maple Hollow. One ran along the edge of the playground mulch, one stood by the mailbox pavilion, another sliced behind the clubhouse parking spaces in a way that made the bored treasurer, who had wandered over pretending to walk his dog, turn around and leave without picking up after the dog. Margaret watched from her front window. I saw the curtain move more than once. That night, I checked my security cameras because something in my gut was tapping me on the shoulder. Sure enough, at 11:43 p.m., Margaret Vale herself appeared on the footage wearing a dark jacket and gardening gloves, carrying a can of black spray paint. She moved like a teenager sneaking out, except teenagers usually have better knees. She bent down by one of Earl's stakes near the trail entrance and sprayed over the pink flag, then trying to pull the stake loose. It did not budge. Earl had driven those things in like he was expecting war. 10 minutes later, another camera caught her husband, Douglas, backing a utility cart near the pond and dumping yard waste across my retained strip, probably hoping to make it look neglected. I watched both clips twice, then made coffee, because nothing says middle-aged revenge like caffeine and file organization. The next morning, I saw Margaret at the mailbox pavilion, pretending nothing had happened. I walked over with my mug and said, "Morning." She ignored me. I said, "Just so you know, tampering with a legal survey marker can carry real penalties in this state." Her hand froze inside the mailbox. I did not mention the camera. I did not have to. Color drained from her face in this slow, beautiful way, like watching a storm cloud realize it had parked over the wrong house. She whispered, "Are you threatening me?" I said, "No, Margaret. I am informing you. There is a difference." That was when the neighborhood started changing. Not openly, not yet. People like to imagine courage arrives with music playing, but most of the time it shows up as a nervous knock after dark. Tom came first, bringing a folder of fines for his basketball hoop, which apparently created visual disharmony. Mrs. Alvarez brought every letter she had saved. A young father named Brian showed me emails where Margaret had threatened legal action over a child's tree swing. Even one of the former board members, a man named Howard, came by looking ashamed and tired. He told me Margaret had known for months that my HOA membership was legally questionable, but she believed pressure would make me comply before I learned enough to fight back. That sentence sat in my chest like a hot coal. Pressure would make me comply. Not law, not fairness, pressure. My lawyer came into the story because of Howard. He told me, "Caleb, you need somebody serious before this gets ugly." So I called Nina Patel, a property attorney my old boss had used during a warehouse dispute. Nina was calm, direct, and had the terrifying habit of going silent when she found something important. She sat at my kitchen table with the deeds, easement, survey, HOA letters, and camera screenshots spread around her, and for nearly 15 minutes she did not say a word. Then she leaned back and said, "Your grandmother either had excellent counsel or a crystal ball." I said, "Is this real?" She looked at me. "It is very real. And if the association has been representing these parcels as common property while knowing ownership was uncertain, they have a problem." I asked how big of a problem. Nina tapped the easement clause with her pen. "Big enough that they should have been nicer to you." Nina was right, of course, but being right on paper and surviving a neighborhood war are two different things. And I knew Margaret was not going to walk away just because a lawyer with a sharp blazer found the truth buried in county records. For about a week, Maple Hollow felt like it was holding its breath. People stopped chatting in driveways. Curtains moved when I walked by. And every time my phone buzzed, I expected another complaint, another threat, another official-sounding letter written by someone who confused authority with font size. Then Howard called me one evening and said Margaret had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line was Community Protection Response, which sounded less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a small country preparing for invasion. I went, not because I thought she would listen, but because by then I understood something important. Bullies love private rooms because private rooms let them control the story. The clubhouse was packed. Margaret stood at the front beside a projector, wearing a cream-colored blazer and the face of a woman who had rehearsed being disappointed in everyone. She talked about outside agitation, legal confusion, threats to property values, and dangerous misinformation. Dangerous misinformation, in her mouth, meant deeds recorded at the county courthouse. She said the association might need a special assessment to defend itself, maybe thousands of dollars per household, and that any resident cooperating with me could be considered part of an effort to undermine the community. That was when Mrs. Alvarez stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice did not. She said, "Margaret, my grandson drew with chalk. You find me like I had built a casino." A few people laughed, not loudly, but enough to crack the room open. Then Tom stood and asked why the board had never disclosed the ownership issue. Brian asked if the playground was really on my land. Howard, poor Howard, looked like he wanted to crawl under the folding chairs, but he finally said the board was aware there were questions. Margaret turned on him so fast you could almost hear the air rip. She said, "Sit down, Howard." And that was it. Not the legal documents, not the survey stakes, not even the deputy leaving my driveway. That little command broke something, because everyone heard it for what it was. Not leadership, control. Half the board resigned before the meeting ended. One woman grabbed her purse and said, "I am not losing my savings because Margaret wanted to win a driveway argument." That line traveled through Maple Hollow faster than gossip at a hair salon. The next morning, I printed flyers for a Saturday cookout at my place. Nothing fancy, burgers, lemonade, bring a side if you want. And under that, I wrote, "Public review of property records at 2 p.m. Nina told me it was either brave or stupid. And I said those two have been cousins my whole life. Saturday came bright and warm. The kind of late summer day where the air smells like cut grass and charcoal, and by noon, there were more people in my yard than had spoken to me in the last 6 months combined. Kids ran around near the old oak. Somebody brought deviled eggs. Tom manned the grill like he'd been waiting his whole life for a civic crisis that involved hot dogs. And for the first time in a long while, Maple Hollow sounded human again. People were laughing, whispering, comparing letters, realizing they had all been scared alone while living 20 yards from other scared people. At exactly 1:57, Margaret arrived. Of course she did. She came walking up my drive with Douglas behind her and a county deputy beside them, not the same one from before, and she carried a red folder like it contained the 10 Commandments. The yard went quiet in waves. Even the kids seemed to understand the villain had entered the third act. Margaret stopped at the edge of the driveway and said, "This gathering is creating a nuisance and may involve the distribution of defamatory materials." I took one step forward, holding a paper plate with a burger on it. Because sometimes history needs a little mustard. I said, "Margaret, this is a barbecue." She looked at the deputy. "Are you hearing this?" He looked around at the folding tables, the lemonade cooler, the children eating watermelon, and said, "Mom, I am hearing lunch." A few people laughed, and Margaret's face tightened so hard I thought her cheekbones might file a complaint. Nina arrived 5 minutes later, calm as church bells, and laid the documents on a folding table in clear plastic sleeves. Deeds, surveys, easement terms, parcel maps, maintenance clauses, screenshots from the cameras, copies of HOA letters. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply explained, piece by piece, that the association had treated private land as common property for years, that its authority over my home had never been established, and that the temporary easement everyone had taken for granted was approaching expiration. And she said the sentence that made the whole yard go still. If Mr. Turner chooses not to renew, the association may be obligated to remove improvements and restore affected land at its own expense. Nobody cheered. That surprised me. In movies, people cheer when the bad guy gets cornered. In real life, people go quiet because they suddenly understand the size of the mess. Margaret tried one last time. She said, "This man is trying to hold the neighborhood hostage." I looked at her then, and all the anger I had been carrying did not explode like I thought it would. It just settled. I said, "No, Margaret. You held them hostage with fear. I'm showing them the key." The deputy closed her red folder and handed it back to her. There was no dramatic arrest, no music swelling, no speech from the heavens. Just Margaret standing in my driveway, finally smaller than the shadow she had been casting. 2 days later, her resignation appeared on the HOA website in a sentence so short it felt embarrassed. A week after that, a moving truck backed into her driveway. By Sunday evening, the house was empty, the blinds gone, the porch swept clean, like Maple Hollow itself had exhaled and erased her. But here is the part people do not always like when I tell this story. Winning did not feel like I expected. I had the documents, the leverage, the legal right to make the association pay dearly. And for one hot minute, I wanted to. I wanted every person who had looked away to feel what I felt. Then Karen Brooks came to my door. She was a 4th grade teacher, quiet, sensible, the kind of woman who could calm a room full of 9-year-olds with one raised eyebrow. And somehow she'd become acting HOA president because everyone else had either resigned or developed sudden back pain. She sat at my kitchen table and said, "Caleb, the playground matters. The pond matters. The mailboxes matter. People need those things." I said, "I know." She said, "You could destroy this place." I looked out the window at the same street where my grandmother used to wave at neighbors from her porch. And I said, "No." Margaret almost did that. I'm deciding whether to finish the job. That was the hardest moment, harder than the deputy, harder than the meeting, because revenge feels clean in your imagination and dirty when you are holding real people's lives in your hands. So we made a deal, a real one, 10-year lease, fair monthly payment, written maintenance standards, no surprise fines, no harassment. No pretending private property becomes community property just because someone says it with confidence. Nina wrote it tight enough to make future tyrants sweat. I waived the old penalties because punishing every family for Margaret's ego did not sit right with me. The lease money now funds a small trade scholarship at the county high school for kids who can wire a panel, weld a gate, rebuild an engine, or fix the things everybody else only complains about. My grandmother would have liked that. Maple Hollow changed after that, slowly, awkwardly, like a person learning to walk after a long illness. Gardens came back. A basketball hoop appeared at the end of Tom's driveway like a flag of surrender in reverse. Mrs. Alvarez's grandson drew the biggest chalk rocket ship you have ever seen, right near the walking trail, and I stood there watching the first rain blur it into color. We had another cookout the next summer, but that one was not a protest. It was just dinner. People stayed late. They talked at the mailboxes again. They waved from porches. And some evenings, when the sun drops behind the pond and my solar panels hum softly on the roof Margaret hated so much, I sit with iced tea in my hand and think about Ruth Turner tapping that spoon against the kitchen table. "Keep the heel," she told me. "One day they will need it." She was right. But I think the part she did not say was this: when they do need it, you better know what kind of man you are. Because power does not change you all at once. It gives you permission to become what was already waiting inside. Margaret used power to squeeze people. I had the chance to use it like a hammer, and maybe some folks think I should have. Maybe you do too. Maybe you think an HOA that abuses people deserves to be burned to the ground legally, financially, completely. Or maybe you think a community is still worth saving, even after it lets the wrong person speak for it too long. I still do not know where that line sits for everybody. I only know where I drew mine. So tell me this: if someone tried to control your home, your land, your peace, and then you discovered you had the power to ruin them, would you take every inch you were owed? Or would you leave enough standing for the neighbors who stayed silent? Drop your answer in the comments, because I promise you, this is one of those questions that says more about us than it does about any HOA.